I just got an email today from a friend who tells me that his stepkid in Cuba is a huge BTS fan. And I just thought that was so amazing because it shows the potential power that South Korea's cultural exports can play in its soft power diplomacy. I mean, Cuba, traditionally an ally of North Korea, and you've got Cuban kids in love with South Korean pop stars. I think that this is such an interesting moment. There are a couple of things. I mean, South Korea, we have to remember that this is a country that has evolved so much from the time I was a kid. Now, I'm Korean American. I'm second generation Korean American, but I was raised going to South Korea in the 70s and 80s. And it went from being this very poor country in a very kind of authoritarian society into becoming a young and vibrant democracy. And I think about how the generation that came of age in the late 80s and early 90s, that's my generation in South Korea. They've been exposed to the world post-Seoul Olympics 1988 with the explosion of the internet that has allowed them to access the rest of the world as well. And they've grown up in a democracy. And all of these things together have meant that we've seen South Korea just blossom into this really vibrant country, both politically and culturally. I'm absolutely excited because as a Korean American, nobody knew where South Korea was. I mean, they vaguely had heard about the Korean War, but they didn't know where it was. And so suddenly to have this be these bands and these movies be such a household name, and for people to be looking for Korean restaurants, asking me about Korean dramas, asking me for advice about where to visit South Korea, there's definitely a sense of Korean pride. And it's such a change from the way that I grew up in post-Vietnam War America, where being Asian was something that was difficult at times, to be honest. And now it's hip to be Korean. It's amazing.
Now, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, you'd have a lot of these conversations about Japan and Japanese rock and fashion forward and whiskey and you name. What's different about it?
I think we have to acknowledge that South Korea, in a sense, is building on everything that they learned from Japan as well, because even in South Korea, there was so much that was inherited from the Japanese, not only because of a colonial period where the Japanese occupied Korea from 1910 to 1945, but also more in recent decades, they did look to Japan as a country that was able to engage internationally and export its culture. Where have they taken it since then? South Koreans are not only good at emulating, but they are really good at innovating, and they've proven that. I think there was a lot of question for years about whether South Koreans were just copying technology, but I think they've proven in the last 10, 15, 20 years that they can innovate as well. I mean, you go to, and I know you've probably been to South Korea, you go
Many
there,
times, yes.
And it feels like this postmodern place now where it's so wired, everything is so high-tech. Everything that we see in the U.S. now, we were seeing 10, 15 years ago in South Korea. So I always see it as being now that kind of cutting-edge postmodern place where you see the intersection of culture and technology in the same way that we used to see in Japan years ago.
And also South Korea, the historic sense, very conservative society, a very gender segregated society. And I mean, clearly with the way South Korea is portraying itself on the global stage, those things also seem to be changing very quickly as well. Does it feel like society is moving that quickly in terms of, really integrating the whole society?
So on that point, I would say that South Korea is still in a period where they have some growing pains when it comes to making sure that all sectors of society are developing at the same warp speed that their economy is developing. It's still very difficult for women. They are not where they need to be when it comes to gender parity. If you look at the charts produced by the OECD, for example, when it comes to the gap in pay between genders, South Korea, unfortunately, is at the very bottom. And so I think, and then there's also the inclusion of the diverse parts of South Korea's society that they still need to work on. This is a country with a really low birth rate. So they do need to think about how to incorporate people from other countries as well as women in the workplace so that they can maintain the economy, maintain the lifestyle, support the future economy. And this is something that they're grappling with because it's always a question of culture when it comes down to it. The South Koreans, they've developed and changed so much and evolved so much so quickly, and they're still grappling with what is Korean that we need to hold on to, what's traditional, what is our culture, and what do we need to give up in order to be a first world country, a donor nation, an international globalized country. And I don't think they're quite there yet, but I think that they're making the baby steps toward becoming a more globalized, inclusive society, but they have a long way to go.
When you think about areas that South Korea will be seen as a global leader, taking aside the advances in soft power, where do you think South Korea is going to be making a true mark? That around the world you'll see people saying, wow, South Korean leadership really made a difference. How do you think that's going to change?
I do think that South Korea still has room to capitalize on the potential that soft power can play. It does remind me a little bit of England in the sense that I think South Korea does punch way above its weight. And in the same way that I think England does in terms of its cultural exports, England does really shape culture in the Western world in such a significant way for such a small country. And I think South Korea has the potential to do that. Not only in Asia, it has already been doing that across Southeast Asia for many years, but internationally as well.